Hey everybody, this is the introduction to the edited volume, um, The Ideas of Leon Trotsky, edited by Hillel Ticktin and Michael Cox. Um, so this is the introduction to that book. Lev Davidovich Bronstein, or Trotsky, who lived from 1879 to 1940, was arguably the greatest orator of the 20th century, certainly one of its finest writers, and undoubtedly one of its most influential revolutionary theoreticians. Trotsky's talents were by any measure considerable, certainly quite extraordinary in comparison with those who have stood in judgment of Trotsky over the years. Trotsky was a brilliant organizer and was in fact, according to Lenin, quote, too much drawn to the administrative side of things, end quote. He had an enormous intellectual range, making important contributions to the study of Tsarist Russia, literary theory, revolutionary history, and our understanding of fascism in a world turned upside down by war and depression. Trotsky was also a principled and brave human being who refused to compromise with Stalin, something that cost both him and his family dear. Trotsky was no political saint, of course, as one of the two men bearing the greatest responsibility for the defense of the early Soviet state. That would have been nigh impossible. Nor was Trotsky always correct. In fact, some of Trotsky's arguments now seem plainly bizarre, especially his mature characterization of the USSR as a workers' state and his strangely upbeat discussion about what was being achieved economically in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Some have argued with some justification, though with little understanding of revolutionary psychology, that Trotsky was too much of an optimist as well. Yet even as at his most optimistic, Trotsky never lost his objectivity, and when Trotsky was wrong or ambiguous, Trotsky was generally more interesting than those who are always right, but never actually say anything, indeed frequently locked away within some of his less assured statements, notably those written in exile through the Soviet Union. About the Soviet Union, there was more often than not a rational kernel of truth straining to get out. Even his mistakes live on in the works of those who might not even be aware of Trotsky's contribution to thought. That is why his work will last. An intelligent, well-read, and it has to be emphasized, a singularly honest man who refused to suffer fools or charlatans gladly, Trotsky was a rare phenomenon in a Machiavellian age. It is hardly surprising that Trotsky and his ideas have had a profound impact on our epoch. Trotsky's influence can best be measured perhaps in the enormous literature on Trotsky. Certainly for one of history's better-known losers, Trotsky seems to have generated an extraordinary amount of interest, and not just by Marxist scholars or revolutionary activists alone. To a large degree, in fact, both his explanation and description of Stalinism have influenced nearly everyone who has written about the phenomenon. There are, moreover, hundreds of articles and literally thousands of shorter pieces on or about Trotsky himself. These range from the vicious to the plainly hagiographic, the utterly tendentious to the intellectually serious. Naturally, being an entirely political being dedicated to the proposition that neither capitalism nor Stalinism offered an answer to humanity's problems, Trotsky has attracted his fair share of political hate mail over the years. For the same reason, his life and work has inspired great loyalty, though it has to be admitted that many of his more dedicated and often courageous followers seem to have spent more of their time attacking each other than critically assessing Trotsky's thought. Fortunately, though somewhat ironically, given his own ambiguous attitude towards Trotskyism, Trotsky has been immensely well served by his first and really his only serious biographer, Isaac Deutscher. Deutscher was always something of a renegade in the wider revolutionary movement, a wonderful stylist with immense empathy for both his subject and the times through which he lived. Deutscher was and still is regarded by many on the left as having conceded far too much to Stalin. One of his severest critics, Max Shachtman, complained, and correctly so, that great writer, though Isaac Deutscher may have been, in the end, Deutscher provided a form of, quote, objectivist apologetics, end quote, for Stalinism by praising Stalin's historical role too highly. But one simply cannot underestimate the impact which Deutscher's truly remarkable trilogy had upon intellectual life in the 1950s and 1960s in particular. With its beautiful prose, its sense of history and feeling for the unfolding tragedy of the interwar years, Trotsky's biography probably did more to bring people to sympathetic view of Trotsky than any other work on the revolutionary prophet who was, as Deutscher so poignantly noted, first armed by the revolution, then outcast by those who usurped it, and finally destroyed by its gravediggers. Though we owe Deutscher a great deal, Deutscher's work, like that of so many others, suffers from a real failure to engage theoretically with Trotsky's ideas. Reconstructing the life and times of the great revolutionary is useful, fascinating even, but it is no longer enough if indeed it ever was, nor is a solution provided by throwing together eclectic collections of conference papers, even less by bringing out journals about Trotsky, edited and directed by those opposed to what he stood for. Critical distance is one thing, but one gets a distinct feeling that something's up when the first piece in the Journal of Trotsky Studies goes to inordinate lengths to prove that one of Trotsky's most profound works, his History of the Russian Revolution, is nothing more than a mere polemic, one which not only misunderstands the underlying cause of 1917, but deliberately, it would seem, overstates his own role during those heady months. To add academic insult to historical injury, Trotsky, we are told, did not even consult the archives. No doubt if he had done so, he would have been forced to tell a very different story than the one he does in his 3 volumes of Invective and Distortion. With friends like this, Trotsky obviously has no need of enemies. Footnote. See James D. White, Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, in the Journal of Trotsky Studies. Yeah.
You want to walk?
Yeah.
Did you want to walk? Yeah.
Whilst bear-baiting Trotsky might still be fashionable, it hardly takes the discussion forward. Hopefully this volume will do so, not by damning Trotsky with faint praise or by seeking to prove that he led the Russian Revolution single-handedly, but rather by engaging with his intellectual and political legacy in an honest and open fashion. Moreover, though each author here treats Trotsky in a very different way, they all do so from a perspective informed by Marxism. We make no apologies for this. Marxism may have a bad name in parts of the academic world and an even worse reputation in the land of the Russian Revolution itself, but in our view there is really no alternative framework from which to judge Trotsky properly. In this very special sense, we thus challenge the thesis put forward by a leading American writer, one not entirely unsympathetic to Trotsky, who has argued that in spite of, rather than because of, his Marxism, Trotsky still had something interesting to say about the world. See Robert V. Daniels, Trotsky, Stalin, and Socialism. End footnote. We proceed from the opposite assumption, adding that only through a critical and creative use of Marxist categories can we fully assess Trotsky's never less than engaged and always engaging analysis of our turbulent times. A positive icon for his followers and a negative one for his enemies, Trotsky often argued that great men were only made great by their times. This particular historical theorem certainly applies to Trotsky himself. Thus, when there was hope and an expectation of change, Trotsky was at his most brilliant and incisive. But when the revolution ebbed, he almost lost his raison d'etre. And while his analysis always remained powerful, it was no longer as profound as it had been in the years of revolutionary possibility. Things were made worse, inevitably, by his living outside the USSR. He could never have known, for instance, of the extent of the famine or guessed at the depth of the purges. He did not even have the necessary Marxist text to consult. And we can only guess as to the impact which the death of his daughters and the murder of his sons had upon him, before he too was murdered by Stalinist agents in Mexico in 1940. New section, Trotsky's analysis. Possibly more than any other Marxist of his day, Trotsky's thought was the most historically sensitive, not in the empiricist sense of piling one fact on top of another, but in terms of uncovering the deeper tendencies at work and seeking to understand where these might eventually lead. History itself may do nothing, as Marx once noted. In Trotsky's analysis, however, there is always a powerful historical dimension in which the present and the past seem to merge as he strives to anticipate the future. This almost panoramic quality, quite absent in the work of, say, Plekhanov or even Lenin, was first graphically revealed in his early and what turned out to be his crucially important writings on pre-revolutionary Russia. On the basis of his own research of Tsarist society, Trotsky, as we know, came to the then heretical, to both orthodox Marxists and liberals alike, conclusion that the obstacles to, quote, normal, end quote, bourgeois development were so profound that there was no possibility of an authentic Western-style capitalism taking root in Russia. From this analysis, first advance in his studies, Results and Prospects of 1906 and Our Revolution of 1907, Trotsky drew an even more heretical set of political conclusions. These are somewhat more complex in nature than his followers later assumed, but at the time went under the simple and unfortunately easily misunderstood heading of permanent revolution. Neither the term itself, of course, nor the reasoning that lay behind it were original to Trotsky. Marx had used the same concept in the mid-19th century in his discussion of the revolutions of 1848. According to Marx, whilst other classes might seize power for a time, only the proletariat could make the revolution permanent. Alexander Helpand, or Parvis, had worked with Trotsky on the concept. Even more interestingly, 2 years after Trotsky had popularized the phrase permanent revolution was also endorsed by the leading Marxist of the day, Karl Kautsky, but it was Trotsky who really developed and extended the theory. Moreover, in his hands it underwent a radical transformation to the extent that it effectively became synonymous for him with the very idea of socialism itself. For Trotsky, permanent revolution consists of three related parts. The first was the notion originally put forward by Marx in 1843 of the working class as the universal class. The working class's historical role, no less, was to emancipate itself and in the process emancipate mankind as a whole. Trotsky then added and incorporated a second idea, that of a decadent Russian capitalism which could no longer fulfill its own tasks of introducing bourgeois democratic forms into Russia itself. That job, Trotsky insisted, would have to fall to the working class. Once in power, however, the proletariat could not stop halfway and would, out of necessity, be impelled to establish its own revolutionary dictatorship. The obvious question then was, what was to be done? If the Russian working class stopped at this point, it would be crushed, if not by the force of arms, then by the social weight of the Russian peasantry in combination with the economic power of world capital. Thus there was no alternative. The revolution had to burst out of its national integument or die. The workers in Russia therefore had to keep moving forward, and the only way forward was to assist workers in other countries, not, it should be emphasized, by direct military means. It was Trotsky, after all, who opposed Lenin in using the Red Army in 1920 to advance the cause of the European Revolution, but in other ways. These might include, amongst other things, theoretical support, diplomatic backing, and if absolutely necessary, money and arms as well. But the main thrust of activity would be political, after 1919 found its organizational expression with the formation of the Third International. It was no coincidence that Trotsky both wrote the Comintern's first manifesto in 1919 and played a leading role in the organization until its demise as a serious revolutionary body in 1923. Once the proletariat of the advanced countries had taken power, a task which Trotsky certainly did not underestimate, the construction of socialism in Russia could begin in earnest. But until that point was reached, the most the besieged regime could do was to conduct a holding operation. This might and indeed did take several forms, such as the exploitation of contradictions within and between the main capitalist countries, the creation of the political and military instruments through which to defend the workers' state, and the pursuit of policies at home whose purpose was to strengthen the position of the working class. But these were temporary measures. They were not the answer itself. They could only be provided when help arrived from the outside. Then and only then could the really serious work begin. But what did this work consist of? Several things, naturally, including the expansion of democracy and the overcoming of material scarcity. But in addition, according to Trotsky, and here both Trotsky and Lenin were as one, there had to be a genuine cultural revolution as well. On this particular subject, Trotsky wrote at great length. Of course, his argument had absolutely nothing to do with the waving of little red books or the sycophantic cult of the great leader that occurred in China in the 1960s. Rather, it looked forward to the education of the whole working population to the point at which it had the information and hence the self-confidence and capacity to govern. And as Trotsky warned, without this, quote, accumulation of culture, end quote, new and politically significant divisions would inevitably arise between those who had knowledge and those who did not. A cultural revolution was not merely educationally desirable, therefore, but politically essential. Indeed, only when everybody had achieved the highest level of education could there be genuine popular control. At that point, the revolution would have become irreversible, in the very real sense of the word, quote, permanent, end quote. Related to, though according to some writers analytically separable from the political notion of permanent revolution, was a second idea, one which has also become closely associated with Trotsky's name, that is the law, or more precisely, the twin laws of uneven and combined development. Though implicit in his earlier writings on Russia, it was only later that Trotsky seemed to invest the two notions with the status of a more general law. In fact, according to Trotsky, the idea of unevenness was the most universal law of history, for it referred basically to the obvious fact that different societies developed at different economic pace. The central problem for Trotsky then was to explain why Russia had failed to develop in the first place, and when it finally did emerge from its long torpor in the second half of the 19th century, why it did so in what he termed a most, quote, peculiar way, end quote. This logically led Trotsky to the second part of his argument. Russia, in Trotsky's view, or more precisely the Russian state, was forced to move towards capitalism not out of internal necessity, but because of external pressure. Existing alone, Russia may have remained a backward society, located somewhere between classical European absolutism and Asiatic despotism. Situated in a sea of international capitalism, it had no alternative but to change. But it did so in a most extraordinary fashion, because onto its original primitive foundations was grafted or, quote, combined, end quote, the most advanced capitalist economic forms. Not surprisingly, the drawing together of these, quote, different stages, end quote, in the historic, quote, journey, end quote, created what Trotsky termed an amalgam-like formation in which the, quote, archaic, end quote, and the, quote, contemporary, end quote, coexisted and interpenetrated in such a way as to create a profoundly unstable society. Moreover, within this society, the Russian working class was likely to play a crucial role. Concentrated as the Russian working class was into huge industrial concerns in a country where the indigenous bourgeoisie was weak, the bulk of Russian capital either being in the hands of the state or the West. Its impact on politics was almost certainly bound to outweigh its sociological strength in the population as a whole. In fact, instead of being condemned to political irrelevance, in Russia there was every chance it could come to power before its peers in the West. Thus far from being fated to wait for an almost inconceivable length of time until the market fully matured, the Russian proletariat could leap over centuries and, in a manner of speaking, move from the back of the revolutionary queue to the front. Such, according to Trotsky, was its privileged historic status. The most important thing that might be said about Trotsky's argument was that it provided Trotsky, well over a decade before the event itself, with a great insight into what later happened in Russia in 1917. One might even suggest that it is virtually impossible to make much sense of the deeper causes of the Russian Revolution without reference to its two laws. But the theory of combined and uneven development was pregnant with all sorts of other intellectual possibilities as well. Firstly, the theory of combined and uneven development implied that Marxists would have to abandon their attachment to the more general thesis that all societies would of necessity have to pass through the same set of historical stages. The theory of combined and uneven development also suggested that the discussion of any one particular country had to be set in the context of a much broader analysis of that particular country's location within the wider world market. If the two laws could be applied to Russia, moreover, there was no reason to believe the two laws could not be applied to other underdeveloped societies as well. And finally, perhaps most significantly of all, if a revolution was more likely to occur in Russia because Russia was backward in a, quote, special, end quote, way, then was not the same likely to happen in other backward countries that had also been compelled to develop under pressure from the West. In this way, Trotsky not only advanced a genuinely original theory about Russia, but provided a key to understanding the world revolutionary process in the 20th century. This brings us to a third concept linked to Trotsky's name, the idea of the modern era as being one of capitalist decline. The view that the accumulation process had entered a critical phase in the first decade of the 20th century was not, of course, just held by Trotsky alone. It had been the position held by nearly all serious Marxists from Rosa Luxemburg to Lenin. Moreover, whilst these two writers had a different view of the underlying cause of the crisis, Both agreed that the main reason it had not fully expressed itself was because capitalism had been given a temporary lease of life by external expansion or imperialism. However, with the coming of the First World War, this temporary, quote, solution, end quote, had clearly reached its limit. Indeed, according to Lenin, the war could only exacerbate the system's underlying contradictions and accelerate its disintegration. Capitalism had entered its final phase. As the first program of the Bolshevik Party put it in 1919, because of the war and the war's most important result, the Russian Revolution, the world had passed from a period of relative class peace to one of intensified class struggle, in which the only conceivable outcome was the dictatorship of the proletariat. Trotsky concurred with this general line of analysis, but Trotsky made a number of original contributions to the general discussion. The first was to root the debate about decline into a much wider historical perspective. Indeed, Trotsky's discussion took him back to the French Revolution through the critical events of 1848 to 1913, the starting point in his view of the new epoch of decline. Secondly, Trotsky also made a clear distinction between waves, these being general and determinate, and cyclical downturns. Thus, Trotsky characterized as, quote, periodic oscillations, end quote, situated within the former. Thus, for example, although the bourgeoisie had gained a temporary breathing space by 1921, the overall trend for capital, Trotsky insisted, was down. The period thus remained revolutionary. Finally, the new epoch would not necessarily last forever. The bourgeois would take all measures necessary to prevent the working class coming to power, and it could in fact defeat the proletariat when what Trotsky called, quote, some new sort of equilibrium, end quote, could be established, albeit at enormous cost to humanity. This leads logically to a fourth contribution he made to Marxism, Trotsky's analysis of the role of democratic organization in the revolutionary process. That last bit was in italics. The role of democratic organization in the revolutionary process. Trotsky developed his own very distinct, non-Leninist views on the question long before 1917. Trotsky, of course, was not against organization as such, as his earlier writings show. What he was against, however, was Lenin's particular views on the party as outlined in What Is to Be Done. Trotsky later claimed that he had been wrong, and that after 1917 there was no better Bolshevik than he. But in this one suspects Trotsky was being more tactical than historically honest. After all, by 1917, Lenin's original views had undergone something of a metamorphosis. Thus, what Trotsky was accepting by then was something utterly different to that laid out by Lenin 15 years earlier. It was also clear that Trotsky had made no such adaptation, as his later disagreements with Lenin over the seizure of power clearly indicated. Lenin, it will be recalled, wished to take power through the party. Trotsky wanted to do so through the medium of the Soviets. The difference was not a minor one, and it reflected still important differences between Trotsky and the Bolsheviks. And though he later espoused the cause of a Leninism he had rejected openly until the October Revolution, there was a very real sense in which he never was and never became a real Bolshevik. The fifth idea associated with Trotsky's name is the belief that it would be impossible to build socialism in one country. That's in italics. Impossible to build socialism in one country. The notion itself was not unique to Trotsky. Indeed, before Stalin and Bukharin suggested otherwise, it was taken as read within the broader Marxist movement that without successful revolutions in most, if not all, the main capitalist countries, socialism could neither be built in one backward country like Russia, nor in fact in any single country situated in a sea of world capitalism. This was certainly the position adopted by Marx. Marx, it is true, hoped that Russia would be able to escape the brutalities of capitalism, but as Marx added in his famous introduction to the Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, Russia would still require technical aid and support from what he hoped would soon be the new workers' states in Western Europe. Otherwise, the whole project was doomed. Trotsky's specific contribution to the debate was not so much in advancing the idea that socialism in one country was a utopian project, but in his systematic defense of the argument and his careful analysis of what would follow both at home and abroad if the USSR proceeded along this path. Trotsky's thesis was as clear as it was obvious. No single country, not even the most advanced, could escape from the international division of labor. If it tried to do so, the results were bound to be disastrous, and in time the country in question would be compelled to rejoin the world market. For at least 50 years, this most simple and eloquent of arguments was derided as pure fantasy by those who sought to defend the Soviet achievement. Not surprisingly, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union's pathetic attempts to become reintegrated into the international capitalist system have done a great deal to rehabilitate Trotsky's original argument. This brings us to Trotsky's sixth intellectual contribution, his explanation for the rise in his mature analysis of Stalinism as a system. That's in italics. Stalinism as a system. Here, there is no point going into great detail, nor should we seek to defend everything that Trotsky wrote on these connected problems. Suffice to make the observation that Trotsky's discussion of the Soviet system remains both highly suggestive but obviously unfinished. Moreover, Trotsky's analysis of Stalinism was a very contradictory amalgam, in part a reflection of Soviet reality itself, partly a function of his attempt to find something progressive in the USSR, and partly a reflection of the fact that after 1929, Trotsky no longer had direct contact with what was going on in the country. Yet in spite of this, Trotsky's writings were sufficiently rich to stimulate a potentially useful discussion between those like Ernest Mandel, who followed Trotsky in regarding the USSR as a variety of a degenerated worker state, and others like Max Shachtman, who saw it as a new mode of production with a new ruling class, or Tony Cliff, who saw it as state capitalist. Unfortunately, what might have been the beginning of an open debate soon turned into a highly sectarian exchange of positions between dogmatists, who were more interested in defending their own political trenches against the real and sometimes mythical forays of their political enemies on the Marxist left than in advancing genuine understanding of the USSR. Onto this highly charged battlefield arrived the journal Critique. If you don't know, the Critique is the journal that's Michael Cox is affiliated with. I think it's really like Hillel Ticktin's original project, but I'm not sure. First issued in 1973, Critique attempted to move the debate beyond the banal and tedious, and if it achieved little else, Critique did at last anticipate the demise of the Soviet system. How it managed to do so will be explained in the next section. New section, the Critique analysis. Because the editors of this volume have been closely involved with Critique since its foundation, it might be useful here to outline the theory that is underpinned what others now refer to as the Critique school of thought. It started from Trotsky's analysis of the defeat of the revolution by a new social group led by Stalin. It then employs the concept of the surplus product, a concept which Trotsky sometimes, but not frequently, deployed in his discussion of the Soviet Union. The crucial question here is one of control. According to Critique, the Soviet ruling group ruled by virtue of its control over the surplus product. However, it was unable to establish full control over the surplus. Moreover, under Soviet conditions, it was obliged to hide its appropriation of the surplus. The workers, for their part, were atomized by a very powerful state apparatus which acted in the interests of the ruling group. The atomization was in turn buttressed by the political-economic individualization of the worker at the point of production. The worker in this position, however, was able to establish a degree of control over his or her own work process. A conflict was thus set in between the organizational function of the ruling group and the self-interest of the exploited and atomized worker. The system could function only as long as there was absolute expansion of labor time. Moreover, because it was not a mode of production, it had a limited lifespan. It had to disintegrate. Naturally, the ruling group constantly tried to eliminate the workers' control over the labor process, but always failed. Thus, ultimately, it took the step, when the system was in terminal decline, of trying to go over to capitalism, the only method available to it of controlling the workers and of maintaining the position of the ruling group. The Critique school thus sought to develop a mature political economy of what it saw, correctly, as a historically unviable system. It also sought to develop Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, which in its opinion had become absorbed, as it were, into the nature of our epoch. Beyond doubt, the concept of a transitional epoch was one of Trotsky's enduring conceptual innovations. Trotsky compared the transition from capitalism to socialism with the previous transition from feudalism to capitalism. Trotsky pointed out the way in which such epochs reflected the insecurity of the times and gave rise to a politics which was well described by Niccolo Machiavelli. Indeed, our times are perhaps the most Machiavellian of all, reflected on the one hand in the lack of trust between people, and on the other in the high level of dishonesty and deception which are part and parcel of modern politics. The change from one mode of production to another, according to Trotsky, could take many years, but the key question, one which led Trotsky to some of his most inspired insights of our age, was what happened if the proletariat overthrew the old order, but failed to install itself in power. Moreover, What would happen if the proletariat was unable to overthrow the old order, but continued to be capable of, though was not yet ready for, revolution? Then, of course, there would be a stalemate. The permanent revolution would become frozen. In fact, if we look at permanent revolution as a dynamic rather than a static category, then we have to conclude that the process can be, and indeed has been, held up. However, because capitalism was overthrown in Russia, the bourgeoisie was then impelled to implement reforms in the shape of full employment, the welfare state, and the full franchise for all. These were all gains made after, and more critically because of, the Russian Revolution. The overthrow of capitalism in one country put the whole system into permanent jeopardy, with the consequence that the ruling class preferred to make concessions in order to stay in power. The working class, in turn, acquired a consciousness of the alternative, which made their demands impossible to refuse outright. It is, of course, possible to argue that the granting of the franchise in the United Kingdom after the First World War, first to all men and then later to women, would have happened in any case. Yet governments only extended the franchise because they had to do so in order to survive. Today, it is impossible to extract the exact importance of any specific event which led to the granting of the franchise. It is not a question of anyone's individual consciousness, but a question of the logic of the events themselves. If revolution breaks out over Europe, as it did, the logical method of containing it is to provide a constitutional parliamentary structure, whereby the government can be removed in such a manner as to favor the ruling class. It has been a highly successful form of delaying the process of change to a socialist society, even though it has meant a series of economic concessions that might not have been made otherwise. In short, it can be argued that the entire political economy of the post-1917 period was shaped by 1917 itself. But the question remains as to how far and to what degree the long pause or delay between the first revolution and its total consummation calls into question the theory of permanent revolution itself. Nationalist revolutions, for instance, seem to prove that the proletariat is not needed to consummate the bourgeois revolution. At this point, it is usual to point out that the ex-colonial world remains dependent on the metropolitan countries. Whilst the Third World is no longer part of a colonial system, it is still controlled through financial and economic institutions. Furthermore, the role of Stalinism cannot be ignored. Stalinism itself is an illegitimate product of the October Revolution, but is nonetheless a product of the October Revolution. Stalinism has been crucial in engendering the modern forms of post-colonial states, many of which have collapsed following the collapse of the USSR. New section. Trotsky in the post-Stalinist epoch. In the Stalinist epoch, from which we are emerging, mistakes were seen as evidence of failure, backwardness, and weakness. Great mistakes, however, can now be understood to result from great acts and great men. Today, we can discuss the thought of Trotsky in the context of the failure of the Russian Revolution, and we can ask the question that he dared not pose. Is the world better off for the Russian Revolution? Was the Russian Revolution a mistake? The terrible disasters which followed represent the costs of the revolution. It may also be argued that the revolution led to Stalinism, which prevented a socialist revolution for most of the century. Was the attempt worthwhile? Of course, history cannot be undone, but the question is not academic because the answer is crucial to understanding the present day. Nor should anyone shirk the question, as most socialists have done for the last 70 years. For those who are fatalists, the answer must be no. For those who see history as an interweaving of accident and necessity, the answer must be a qualified yes. The result was not a foregone conclusion. The revolution might have triumphed in Germany or elsewhere. The proletariat was bound to try to take power at some point, and there was no guarantee of victory. Any defeat brought the possibility of an unheard of retribution. The same problem remains today. Furthermore, the Russian Revolution showed the world that capitalism was not eternal, and that an alternative was possible. In order to contain it, the bourgeoisie made concessions which altered the nature of capitalism itself. Nothing could justify the millions killed by Stalinism in the name of socialism, but that is not the point. In the period before Stalin, the Russian Revolution had already changed history. It gave the masses the world over the hope that they could someday determine their own destiny. It was the Russian Revolution which marked the beginning of the transition period through which we are still living. The ruling class did not then, and will not now, willingly give up, and unfortunately there may be many defeats before a truly human society arrives. It was Trotsky who understood the concept of the epoch of transition, even if he could not have known or predicted its depth or the extent of human misery. Trotsky's role in history is already set. Trotsky was crucial to the success of the Russian Revolution of 1917, both as an organizer of the Red Army and as a theoretician. Trotsky's book, History of the Russian Revolution, is possibly his most important work, not just because it gives an unsurpassed non-Stalinist Marxist view of the Russian Revolution, but rather because it is a textbook on the nature of a revolution itself in the 20th century. Luxemburg discussed the question of working-class consciousness. Gramsci wrote much on how to alter working-class consciousness, but it was only Trotsky who became part of the process itself. Trotsky understood the nature of the changing moods of the masses, the relationship of those changing moods with the political actions and programs of the political parties. Lenin was supreme in political maneuvering, but Trotsky eschewed that process in favor of interaction with the masses. That was Trotsky's strength as well as his weakness. When the workers were worn out, maimed, injured, or demoralized by the process of war, civil war, and famine, Trotsky no longer had an audience. When Lenin proposed a bloc against Stalin, Trotsky did not follow it through. Trotsky later argued that he could not seize power without popular support because Trotsky would then have been forced to rely on the social forces which supported Stalin. The question remains open. If Lenin had been in his place, Stalin would have been removed without ceremony, but it is not clear that the situation would have been salvaged. With the benefits of hindsight, we can say that there would have been no forced collectivization, no famine, no purges, and possibly even no Hitler. In that case, Trotsky owed it to humanity to have taken power and saved the tens of millions. In that case, Trotsky owed it to humanity to have taken power and saved the tens of millions who were killed in those barbaric episodes. But then, how could Trotsky have known? All right, 1 second. Politics and the political party. Trotsky has been attacked on the grounds that he was no politician. As we have argued above, there is an element of truth in the charge. Not being a Machiavellian, Trotsky had no personal interest in taking power. Only latter-day Stalinoids tried to foist the fantastic charge of self-promotion on Trotsky. Trotsky's problem, if there was one, was not ambition but self-denial. Trotsky wrote several times to Lenin that he could not become his successor as he was Jewish, and the Russian people had not yet jettisoned anti-Semitism. This statement does not ring true. No Marxist could refuse to lead because of his ethnic background. We have to suspect that Trotsky at first was not prepared to lead. Later, of course, he refused to take power. Trotsky was the leader of the Red Army, and in 1924, Antonov Ovsenko, the chief political commissar of the Red Army, actually proposed that Trotsky take over. Let's see if my internet works enough to look up this person. Vladimir Alexandrovich Antonov Ovsenko lived from 1883 to 1938. Was a prominent Bolshevik leader, Soviet statesman, military commander, and diplomat. So, back to the text. Trotsky was the leader of the Red Army, and in 1924, Antonov Ovsenko, the chief political commissar of the Red Army, actually proposed that Trotsky take over. Stalin suggested the same thing, though in the expectation that the offer would be declined. Lenin would not have had to be asked a second time. Trotsky was clearly the most able, intelligent, far-sighted, and gifted member of the Bolshevik Central Committee, but Trotsky preferred to hold back. There is, however, an aspect of this charge which is worth exploring. It concerns Trotsky's view of the political party. In 1904, Trotsky expressed himself clearly against Lenin's concept of the party. Trotsky was against the centralization of power in one man, the discipline of the factory, and the substitution of the party for the working class. Trotsky's concept of the party was closer to that of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, shorn of its bureaucratic and conservative tendencies. Trotsky had served as president of the St. Petersburg Soviet in 1905 and in 1917. More than any of the Bolsheviks, Trotsky had a conception of what the Soviets represented. Indeed, Trotsky refused to sanction the taking of power in October 1917 until it was endorsed by the Soviets. As we have seen, this led Trotsky to refuse power in 1923-24. On the other hand, Trotsky had expressed himself from 1917 onwards in favor of the Bolshevik Party. Moreover, the Fourth International, which Trotsky founded in 1938, was based on the conception of the Bolshevik Party. It is true that the Bolshevik Party of November 1917 was very different from the earlier Leninist conception of the party, but it retained important aspects. This is a side note. What's his name? Ernie Haberkern, who edited the volume Neither Capitalism Nor Socialism, Theories of Bureaucratic Collectivism. He edited it with Arthur Lippow. He says something to the effect in a review article that I'm going to put up on this, that like Trotsky's conception of the party post-1917 more or less was drawn from the political conceptions of Grigory Zinoviev. I don't know much about Zinoviev, and I don't know much about his ideas or anything like that, but I know he was like the guy who was like the leadership of the Comintern during like the Bolshevization of the national communist parties. So I don't know if that's relevant here, but if Hillel Ticktin and Michael Cox were here, I'd ask them what they thought of that. Anyway, back to the text. It is true that the Bolshevik Party of November 1917 was very different from the earlier Leninist conception of the party, but it retained important aspects. The Bolshevik Party of November 1917 was vanguardist and highly centralized. The Bolshevik Party of November 1917 showed Lenin's disregard for internal democracy. It was not that there was no internal democracy, but internal democracy was limited and was ignored when required by the important leaders. This ambiguity has never been resolved. It is not clear whether Trotsky had rejected his 1904 critique of Lenin. It is possible that Trotsky accepted the party as a necessary evil, but then could find no way out when placed in an environment where loyalty to Lenin and the party was everything. Trotsky appears to have been trapped between his own need for democratic forms and his acceptance of the Bolshevik Party. Whereas Lenin had no time for formal democratic niceties and was consequently quite prepared to remove Stalin as soon as possible in 1923, Trotsky preferred a more constitutional course. Trotsky's Fourth International was similarly suspended between vanguardism and democracy. That's super interesting. All Marxists, as opposed to Stalinists, take the view that in the end the working class must govern itself. The workers' councils or Soviets are the obvious form of that self-government. Lenin, however, preferred to shortcut this elementary workers' democracy. There were two grounds on which he could do so. The first was that Russia was an overwhelmingly peasant country, and the peasantry was necessarily in favor of small private property. Hence the results were both a small minority. Hence, the workers were both a small minority in themselves of peasant background. As a result, it became necessary to take power, but only as a means of assisting the revolution in other countries. As for the charge of the Bolsheviks' quote, undemocratic, end quote, seizure of power, it has to be remembered that the full franchise for all male and female adults had not yet been fully granted in most countries of the world in 1917. In the second place, it was a period of generalized warfare and barbaric killings. It was also a period of massive discontent with general strikes and a demand for change of the old order. How then could the change take place? One way was to simply take power in the name of the proletariat and short-circuit the whole process. Indeed, all attempts in Germany, Hungary, etc. failed. The very drastic action of the authorities of the old order, both internal and external, in Russia, Germany, and Hungary showed that a simple seizure of power by workers' councils could not succeed without an organized and armed force on the side of the workers. Trotsky went along with Lenin's party after July 1917, seeing the taking of power in Russia as the first step in the move to socialism in the world. Trotsky had never seen the peasantry as anything other than allies of the working class, but the destruction of the working class in the Civil War and the harsh measures required by that war meant that the Bolshevik Party was left without a popular base. What could socialists do under those circumstances? They could not build socialism in one country. Until 1923, there was some hope that the workers could seize power in Germany, but after then it looked very unlikely. Indeed, the mutation of the Bolshevik Party into a proto-Stalinist party was already underway after 1921, and its conversion now looked inevitable. The solution to Trotsky's dilemma is not obvious. He could have left the country in the early 1920s. Indeed, Trotsky did propose early in 1923 to go to Germany to assist the German Revolution. What would have happened if the Bolsheviks had not taken power in 1917? It is not difficult to see that Russia would have been no different from its neighbors. There would have been an early form of fascism, or at least white terror, with all the anti-Semitism and ethnic brutality that was shown in the Civil War by the whites. The left would have been physically exterminated just as they were at the time of the Paris Commune. At the same time, the economy would have remained as backward as it had been. The Tsarist Russia was no Japan, and even if it had recovered somewhat in 1929, the World Depression would have thrown it back. In a sense, then, the Bolsheviks had no choice. They were chosen by history, and they won the battle of the Civil War only to lose the immediate socialist war. This is at least is the sense that one gets from Trotsky. At the same time, there is another way in which they won in the end. Stalin's defeat of the October Revolution could not erase the October Revolution itself from its impact on world history. Capitalism had been shown to be vulnerable. An alternative became possible, which even the triumphalism over the fall of Stalinism cannot transcend. Ever since the October Revolution, the institutions of a declining capitalism have reflected that initial abortive triumph. Trotsky always looked to history, and in that sense he has been victorious. Nonetheless, the question remains as to whether the shortcut did not delay the world revolution and the move to socialism. It is almost 80 years since the October Revolution, and there are no substantial socialist parties today in any country. Socialism is here defined in the sense used by Trotsky, that of a new socio-economic system in which wage labor is abolished and the proletariat is in power. There is no mass party today which espouses such principles. On the contrary, the Stalinist parties have become at best social democratic, while social democracy itself now supports the concept of the eternal nature of the market and wage labor. Trotsky's Fourth International never took off except as a flight of tiny sects. What is obvious is that the degeneration of many of these Trotskyist groups into semi-Stalinist sects has been helped by their absurd pretensions to be mini-Leninist parties. Trotsky had no successor, and he was unable to train one. He was a man of action who wrote the theory for that action. He was neither an abstract educationist nor a mere political fighter, nor, it has to be added, was he Karl Marx. New section. The question of the nature of Stalinism. The second charge against Trotsky is that he misunderstood the nature of the new regime under Stalin. This in the charge that he was no politician are linked in that it would have been his duty to have taken power from Stalin if he had understood the nature of the counter-revolution that was to occur. His analysis of Stalinism became increasingly critical as time went on. But, and this is vital, he failed to understand the true nature of the beast in the crucial years when he could have prevented its rise. Others, such as those in the democratic centralists, took a very much stronger line much earlier. Trotsky, however, argued firstly for opposition within the party and then for loyal opposition outside it. It was only in 1933 that he finally declared the party dead and the Communist International dead with it. But even then he continued to support the USSR, seeing nationalization and, quote, planning, end quote, as crucial anti-capitalist gains which had to be defended. Amazingly, Trotsky still characterized Stalinism, even in its most barbaric years, to be a centrist phenomenon. Trotsky viewed Bukharin as a rightist and therefore pro-bourgeois, and until his death he persisted in arguing that the Soviet Union was a degenerate worker state which defended workers, however badly. Thus Trotsky did not act against Stalin decisively enough precisely because he failed to understand the nature of the regime that was coming into existence. As a result, Trotsky not only failed to take power but also stood opposed to direct popular action against the regime. Great men make great mistakes. Ordinary people may not make any mistakes because ordinary people do not have the opportunity or the ability to do so. Trotsky could not conceive of the magnitude of the retreat and the real defeat that had occurred. The democratic centralists, some Mensheviks, the anarchists, and other Marxists opposed Stalin earlier and more strongly, but they never had any hope of success. Their failure largely arose from their inability to understand the process any better. In fact, a cursory look at all these left oppositions shows an analysis which is hardly worth reading. It is most usually no more than a series of empirical and worthy humanist and democratic statements. Even the later opposition of Bruno Rizzi, James Burnham, and Max Shachtman had almost no political economy. It was further marred by the quite obvious lack of empirical knowledge of their subject matter of the USSR. Their doctrine of bureaucratic collectivism was and remained little more than a slogan. The state capitalist viewpoint was put forward very early on by the Mensheviks, but again it lacked any reality. Its later reincarnation in the works of Tony Cliff and his followers, as well as in the sayings of Mao and his followers, could have little in real meaning other than that of a slogan expressing contempt for Stalinism, or in the latter case, Stalin's successors. As a result, it is not surprising that Trotsky emerged unscathed from any and all theoretical battles. Indeed, the later Trotskyists, who dogmatically repeated all Trotsky's sayings, still appeared often to be superior to their more critical opponents for the same reasons. The theoretical result, however, has been disastrous. Whereas Trotsky himself was a complex, many-sided, and sometimes contradictory thinker, his followers often became semi-Stalinist iconographers. The fault here lies in part in Trotsky's legacy, insofar as Trotsky failed to fully comprehend the nature of Stalinism itself. One can, of course, argue that he did say that its nature was undetermined, and that he therefore cannot be blamed for the wrong attitude of his so-called followers. The problem, however, is that he always regarded Stalin as a centrist, even if he was politically worse than Hitler. It is almost impossible to square this circle. On the one hand, Stalin was counter-revolutionary, a monster responsible for the deaths of millions, whilst on the other he defended nationalized property. Trotsky insisted that there was planning in the USSR, but also said that there was no planning in the USSR. Stalin defended nationalized property, but on the other hand, Trotsky said that he was the organ of the bourgeoisie. A scholastic follower might produce a formally logical reply, but no one else could do so. Under conditions where opposition to Stalinism often meant death both in East and West, it is not surprising that with this legacy the Trotskyists often became scholastic sectarians, the monks of our time. The Soviet Union was not a worker state, and there was no workers' movement left in that country. The defeat of our time was far more complete than Trotsky could have imagined. It may be that his revolutionary optimism prevented Trotsky from seeing the very depths of misery to which the one-time revolutionary country had sunk. It may well be that it was Trotsky's optimism which kept the socialist candle burning at a time when Stalinism had plunged the world into a dark age with which no other is comparable. New section: Trotsky and the End of Stalinism. The death of Stalinism permits us to make a creative reassessment of Trotsky's ideas. Trotsky's critical attitude to the former USSR and his savage critique of Stalin are vindicated. A number of his critics, including Deutscher, argue that Trotsky had gone too far in his book on Stalin, his last unfinished work. In fact, the knowledge of the depth of Stalin's crimes gets deeper with the years. The concept of the impossibility and inherent falsity of the doctrine of socialism in one country is now widely accepted far beyond the ranks of Trotskyists. Permanent revolution as the modern version of the task of the proletariat in emancipating mankind is less well known and is less generally accepted. Some consider that countries like India show that national and bourgeois democratic revolutions are possible, whereas others hold that India is not independent economically and thus is not politically independent. Others assert that we are in an epoch of contending forces of which the outcome is not yet determined. In a sense, the epoch itself is one of permanent revolution. It is now clear that no, quote, national liberation movement, end quote, has succeeded beyond the immediate aim of removing the direct political control of the colonial power. In most cases, the country has succumbed to neocolonial domination. In the case of countries in which Stalinism assumed power, we can see a complex result. On the one hand, in those countries which have overthrown Stalinism, there's an overwhelming dependence on the West, whilst in the remaining Stalinist country there is neither bourgeois democracy nor a real independence from the Western powers. Whatever the conclusion, it is clear that the concept of permanent revolution may be used as a creative tool but not as a dogmatic restatement of Trotsky's correctness. In part, the problem goes back to Trotsky's inability to cope with the theoretical nature of Stalinism. The reason may have to do with the accidental nature of Stalinism itself, or the fact that Trotsky was killed before he could comprehend its full horror, but it makes little difference. As long as Stalinism is regarded as centrist, then Stalinism's doctrines have a limited degree of validity, and Stalinism's actions can deserve a limited defense. Then, in contrast to the doctrine of permanent revolution, it can be argued that local elites can achieve independence from imperialism.
Put differently, the doctrine of permanent revolution stands resolutely against any two-stage revolution in the movement to socialism, that is, a primary capitalist stage. And when a subsequent socialist stage, a strategy which Stalinism has consistently insisted on imposing. The effect has been to assist new elites in seizing power who have then turned on the left and destroyed the left. This happened from the time of Chiang Kai-shek in 1927 to 28 onwards. Indeed, at that time, Trotsky engaged in a written polemic with Evgeny Preobrazhensky, who, against Trotsky's arguments, insisted on the necessity of a two-stage revolution in China. The failure of Stalinism in Stalinism's homeland and in the Third World has led to considerable gloom within the left. Some speak of a crisis of Marxism. Trotsky's analysis leads to a different conclusion. Marx himself argued that for the revolution to be permanent, the workers had to seize power. Up to that point, there can be only failure. The history of the 20th century is replete with the failure of revolutionaries to introduce the socialism that they had promised the masses. It is not surprising that the masses do not trust any revolutionaries. For Trotsky, as for Marx, there is no such thing as socialism without the working class in power. Undemocratic socialism is not socialism. Planning without democracy is not planning. The doctrine of permanent revolution is untarnished. As such, the doctrine of permanent revolution is a doctrine of hope and optimism in a world of despair and hopelessness. New section, unnamed. This volume consists of two main parts. In the first section, there are several essays analyzing the ideas of Trotsky. In the second part, we have translated and here published for the first time in the English language two of Trotsky's key speeches of the 1920s. We also reproduce a letter by Trotsky written in 1909 on party education. Together, the articles and speeches make this the most significant volume ever published on Trotsky. It's a very bold statement. The book opens with 4 essays by Hillel Ticktin on political economy. The first deals with Trotsky's analysis of pre-revolutionary Russia, showing inter alia the important differences between Lenin and Trotsky, and why the debate on Russia has such relevance for understanding the more general phenomenon of underdevelopment in the 20th century. The next 2 essays critically examine Trotsky's analysis of the USSR, with special attention being paid here to both the strengths and weaknesses of Trotsky's emerging theory of the transitional epoch. The last essay in this section looks at Trotsky's political economy of capitalism. The author begins with a discussion of method and the notion of equilibrium, then provides a detailed assessment of Trotsky's views on capitalism, and goes on to look at his theories of crisis imperialism, Taylorism, and fascism. The discussion on political economy is followed logically enough by 6 essays dealing with politics, philosophy, and culture. The first 2 by Lin Poole and Antonio Carlo. I have a couple pieces by Antonio Carlo in here. One's on Bruno Rizzi and the other's on crisis in the Soviet Union. The first 2 by Lin Poole and Antonio Carlo tackle the question of organization and the degree to which Trotsky abandoned his earlier views on the subject in favor of Leninism. Both Poole and Carlo seek to challenge this thesis and in the process provide us with a very different reading of the pre-revolutionary period to that normally advanced by conventional and left-wing historians. So too does Stephen Dabadine. Let me see if there's anything. Anyway. The discussion on political economy is followed, but where am I at now? Shit, I'm getting lost. Stephen Dabadine. I don't see anything from Stephen Dabadine. Concentrating on the debate between Trotsky and Lenin around the slogan of the United States of Europe, Dabadine reveals how this discussion masked an even greater divide between the two men about the relationship they say they saw existing between Russia and the European Revolution. The essay by Michael Louvy also deals with Lenin as much as it does with Trotsky and seeks to show a connection between Lenin's espousal of the April theses and Lenin's earlier reading of Hegel. David Gorman provides a critical assessment of Trotsky's legacy. Anything from David Gorman. While accepting that Trotsky was probably the most sophisticated Marxist of this century, Gorman insists that Trotsky's writings cannot provide a genuine foundation for understanding the present epoch. Finally, Alan Wald, I have a piece by Alan Wald here on the political trajectory of James Burnham. Finally, Alan Wald takes a look at Trotsky's views on literature and revolution. The third section on history contains 3 essays. David Law provides useful empirical background on the origins of the left opposition in 1923. Richard Day goes on to examine the political economy of the left opposition, refuting in the process the absurd but influential and popular charge that Trotsky's economic ideas of the 1920s provided Stalin with a program which he then implemented in the 1930s. In the last essay, Susie Weissman looks very critically at Victor Serge's stormy relationship with Trotsky in exile. Though sensitive to Trotsky's position, the author raises critical questions about Trotsky's often harsh judgments about one of his more talented and justly famous followers. The last section of this part contains 5 review essays dealing with Trotsky and his various interpreters. The first 2 by Michael Cox deal with the way Trotsky has been interpreted, or more precisely misinterpreted, by both his friends and enemies. Firstly, in an extensive critique of Perry Anderson, Michael Cox mounts a sustained polemic against the New Left. Then, in a bibliographical study, he goes on to show how Trotsky can be utilized to understand the collapse of the Soviet system. David Law follows up with an extensive analysis of how Trotsky should not be analyzed. This section concludes with critical reviews of 2 books on Trotsky, one by the historian Barak Paz and the other by the French Trotskyist Pierre Bruet. While the contributors here might agree about basics, each has his or her own interpretation of Trotsky's work. Hence, we have not attempted to make the book more consistent, but left it to the reader to note the differences in emphasis and interpretation. On the one hand, the essays are united in at least 3 very obvious respects. First, though each of the authors have approached the subject with a degree of intellectual respect, none here merely seeks to repeat Trotsky's formulae. The authors are also united in a second equally important way. In their rejection of the simplistic and political dubious argument that Lenin and Trotsky were as one. Indeed, nearly all the contributors demonstrate a clear distinction between Lenin's and Trotsky's Marxism. Once seen as a mark of Trotsky's obvious political and intellectual inferiority, these differences are taken here as an indication of Trotsky's innovative contribution to Marxism. Finally, part of the strength of this volume is that its various contributors attempt to examine Trotsky rather than merely repeating Trotsky. In this sense, they approach his ideas very much as Trotsky himself approached those of Marx and Engels, as tools to be used, not as catechisms to be repeated. We can only hope the book stimulates its readers in the same way. Final section. Louis Sinclair, 1909 to 1990. This volume is dedicated to Louis Sinclair. Louis was a lifelong Trotskyist who dedicated the last 30 or so years of his life to producing a comprehensive bibliography of Trotsky's writings. He never asked for any recognition, and he even gave his collection of Trotskyiana to Glasgow University free of charge, without any indication on the books from whence they came. Louis was a very modest man who saw himself as making his contribution to the struggle for socialism through his bibliographic work. Sinclair provided a chronological list of Trotsky's works as they were published and republished. The book therefore served both as a list of the works of Trotsky in the various languages, as well as lists of republications of Trotsky's works over the world. The first task was probably more interesting to scholars, while the second served the purpose of the revolutionary movement in pinpointing the gradual rehabilitation of Trotsky himself. Louis was very excited that Trotsky was finally republished in the USSR. In a sense, Louis' task was never over. All right, that's the end.